Hi, my name is Michael Whitworth, and I want to thank you for joining me in this Life in the Shadow of Death Grief seminar. I'm grateful that you've taken part of your day to spend with me in your desire to become more literate in grief. This seminar is spread out across 3 sessions, and in this first session, we're going to be talking about the Bible and grief, and more specifically asking the question, how are the 5 stages of grief reflected in the Scriptures? Before we get started with this seminar, however, I want to make something very, very clear. I am not a licensed professional. I am not an expert in grief or grief counseling or grief recovery. I have had no formal training in this. I don't have a bunch of letters after my name. But I do come at this from an experiential perspective. About 15 years ago, when I was a junior in college, my dad unexpectedly passed away in a home accident. He was only 44 and I was 19. And even though I've often told people I had a great education growing up, I was never prepared to preach my father's funeral when I was only 19. And for a long time, as I began to work through that grief, I came to realize that, everybody has one tough thing that they have to go through in life. For some people, it's when they're younger, maybe childhood leukemia. For others, it's when they're middle-aged, whether it be bankruptcy or divorce. Or for still others, it's when they're older, say cancer or the like. But everybody has one tough thing they have to go through in life. And I just assumed that losing my dad at such a young age would be the one tough thing I had to deal with. And from here on out, life was going to be all downhill and very, very easy. I thought that for a long time. But 11 years after my father passed away, my wife and I, our oldest child, our son Daniel, unexpectedly passed away in the middle of the night. And 4 years later, we have absolutely no idea what happened, none whatsoever. He was completely healthy. For whatever reason, the Lord has asked me to walk through the valley of the shadow of death, not once, but twice in just a few short years. I was not prepared to preach my father's funeral at 19. I certainly was not prepared to preach my son's when I was only 30. And so I cannot come at this conversation or topic from an expert perspective, but I can come at it from an experiential, from a biblical perspective, and that's what I hope to share with you in this seminar. As we get started thinking about the 5 stages of grief, I want to mention a couple of initial thoughts that are going to help you as we go through this conversation. Number 1, these stages are what some people will feel, but not all. In other words, not everybody goes through the 5 stages of grief. Not everybody experiences all 5. In fact, generally speaking, I have found that the more anticipated a death was, the fewer the stages of grief a person will go through after the death has taken place. For example, if you are a caregiver for maybe an aged parent or a spouse or even a child, and you've been caring for that person for many years now, watching them slowly decline, you knew that death was coming. You went through some of the stages of grief before the death, probably starting perhaps with the diagnosis, or maybe when you realized that they weren't going to get better. And then you experienced a few others after the death had taken place. And so not everybody will go through the 5 stages of grief after a death has taken place for a variety of reasons. Number 2, these stages are not linear or sequential. They don't go in a nice, neat order. You might go from a 1 to a 5 to a 2 to a 3 to a 4 to a 1 to a 5 to a 2 to a 4 to a 1 to a 3. The going through the stages of grief is very disorganized and very, very messy. And that's important to keep in mind. You don't progress through the stages of grief in a nice, orderly stage 1, stage 2, stage 3, and so on. In fact, that is why I don't like thinking of these as stages per se. I personally prefer the word emotion. These are 5 emotions that you will experience as a part of the grief journey. However, all of the literature retains the word stage, and so that's the one that we're going to use in our time together. So just know that when you hear me use the word stage, as in the stages of grief, know that I'm really thinking about emotion, the emotions of grief. Also, there is no time limit with these stages of grief. You might remain in some stages for a couple of moments and others for a couple of months or even years. You cannot put yourself on an arbitrary timetable and think, well, by this point I should have been past that. It doesn't work that way. Learn to give yourself grace and recognize that these stages have no time limit. Finally, think about this. No one is going to go through the stages of grief exactly like someone else. Perhaps many years ago, you saw your parents grieve the loss of your grandparents. And now, years later, your parents have passed away and you're grieving their loss. And you think that you're going to go through the stages of grief like they did when your grandparents passed. Nothing could be further from the truth. Everyone grieves differently. Nobody will go through the stages of grief exactly like someone else. And also, maybe you have lost a loved one in the past, and now you have a spouse or a friend or children. They are grieving a loss, and so you expect those people to go through grief like you did. Again, nothing could be further from the truth. Recognize that just as no two snowflakes are alike, no two people are alike, no two people are going to grieve the same way. As we move into this discussion of the stages of grief, I want you to especially remember this if you forget everything else I say in this session. When I was in local work as a local minister, whenever I would get the call that someone had passed away and I went to the hospital or the funeral home or the family home, whenever I would get there and go through the initial expressions of sympathy, I'm so sorry, we love you, can we have a prayer? After I had gone through those initial expressions of sympathy, I sat down with the family and I told them this. I want you to remember this as we go through this journey together. Whatever you feel and whenever you feel it is completely normal. Whatever you feel and whenever you feel it is completely normal. This was my way of trying to hit home for them or press home to them that they were not going to go through the stages of grief in a, quote, normal fashion, that their experience was going to be unlike anyone else's. And as a result, they needed to give themselves grace. There is no normal when it comes to the stages of grief and grief recovery. Everyone goes through it on their own. And so whatever you feel and whenever you feel it is completely normal. Psychologists have identified 5 main stages of grief, and what I would like to do in this first session is to go through these each one by one and talk about what they look like and also how they are reflected in Scripture, that we might discover that God has actually created us to feel these 5 emotions as part of the grief recovery process, that when we feel these emotions, there's nothing wrong with us. The first stage of grief is the stage of denial, the stage of denial. This is often exhibited as a sense of shock or disbelief. I remember when both my dad died and my son died, I remember being at the funeral home for the visitation, and as people were coming to the funeral home to greet me and my family, I remember going into minister mode and that I was greeting them and thanking them for coming and trying to comfort them. And I also saw my mom and my wife go into preacher's wife mode with my dad and son respectively. I think that was a sense of shock that we were trying to comfort them as they were trying to comfort us. I kind of went into minister mode a little bit. A few months after my dad passed away, I remember one of my teachers in college, one of my Bible teachers, took me aside and made this statement. He said, Michael, a lot of us have been worried about you because your attitude when your dad died seemed to be, well, my dad died and he was a good man and he's in heaven now. What's for lunch? Again, I think that he was trying to say I was still in shock or disbelief, and I can't say that he was wrong. Recognize that this stage of denial is more symbolic than it is literal. We're not really talking about people walking around literally refusing to believe that a death has taken place. Instead, they might say things like, this is just a bad dream that I'm going to wake up from at any moment and recognize that none of this was real. In fact, it's actually very common in the aftermath of grief for weeks and months and even years for people to have dreams in which their loved one is still alive, they never died, and yet when they wake up, there's that horrible pit in their stomach when they recognize, no, their loved one is still dead and there's nothing that they can do about it. Other people exhibit denial by saying things like, I just expect him to walk through the door any moment now. I've often heard this from the lips of widows who obviously lost their husband, and they were accustomed to him being gone during the day, maybe between 8 and 5 or whenever. They were used to him coming home at a certain hour every afternoon, and while during the day day, it's not so difficult. Late in the afternoon when they think that he should be arriving home and yet he never does, that's very difficult for them to deal with. Sometimes we think that this is just a terrible joke gone horribly wrong. I remember thinking about 2 weeks after my son passed away, it was Christmas Eve. I was sitting in my living room, and I remember thinking that any moment, any moment, someone was going to knock on my door and explain that this was all a horrible joke, gone bad, gone wrong, and there was actually nothing wrong with my son. He was okay. Here he was. We're so sorry this got out of hand. Merry Christmas. Obviously, that did not happen. I believe that the stage of denial is actually something that places us on autopilot so that we can function initially. It's not that we go numb, but it allows us to function in the initial days of dealing with grief. I actually believe that denial is a grace from God. In other words, if it were not for denial, all of the feelings of grief would overwhelm us initially. I believe that denial is a grace from God, that it regulates the feelings of grief, lest we experience them all at one time and be overwhelmed. I believe that denial is something from God that is intended to be a gift to help us initially with our grief and help recover from our grief. I also believe that the stage of denial is reflected in the Bible. For example, in Psalm 55, verses 4 through 7, hear what David has to say. My heart is in anguish within me. The terrors of death have fallen upon me. Fear and trembling come upon me, and horror overwhelms me. And I say, oh, that I had wings like a dove. I would fly away and be at rest. Yes, I would wander far away. I would lodge in the wilderness. Notice those last few phrases there. David is saying, I wish I was a bird that I could fly away and not have to deal with this. I wish I could go away and live in the wilderness, live in the country, live in the mountains, in a log cabin somewhere, and not have to deal with the reality that is before me. I know that I have felt like that in the past, and I imagine that you have too. As I have said, there is a grace in denial. Eventually, though, the feelings of denial start to wear off, and that is when we begin to experience all of the feelings that we have been denying. And that brings us to the second stage of grief, and that is anger, the stage of anger. The stage of anger manifests itself in a variety of different ways. Maybe anger at yourself for not doing more to take care of your loved one. Anger at your loved one that they did not take better care of themselves. Anger at others, maybe family members or doctors, a drunk driver for their role in causing or maybe not preventing the death. Or maybe even anger at God for allowing the death to take place. What I want you to recognize, and this is a very significant point, what I want you to recognize is that this anger is seldom reasonable or logical. Rather, it exists in a place in your heart that reason cannot access. Let me say that again. The anger that we feel as a part of the grief journey is seldom reasonable or logical. Rather, it exists in a place in your heart that reason and logic cannot access. Oftentimes in my past, as I have been dealing with grief, I was feeling anger, and I knew that anger was irrational. What you need to know about me is I am a hyper-rational person. Everything has to make sense. Everything has to be nice and logical and reasonable. And I knew I was angry. I knew the anger was not reasonable or logical. I knew it didn't make sense. And so I got down on myself. I made myself feel guilty for being angry for no good reason. This is a moment when you need to give grace to yourself and recognize that if you feel angry for no good reason as a part of your grief, it's not supposed to make sense. Don't expect it to make sense. Give yourself that grace. It's okay to be angry for no good reason. We see anger as a part of grief represented a couple of times in the Bible. I'm thinking about John chapter 11, where Jesus finds out that his friend Lazarus is dying, and he intentionally delays in going to Lazarus' side. When he does show up in Bethany, Lazarus' sister Martha comes storming out of the house, and she's angry with the Lord for not being there to heal her brother, to fix what was wrong. Notice what she says in John 11 and verse 21. Master, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. You almost want to hand her a towel so that she can mop the bitterness off of her chin. Martha is bitter at the Lord. She's angry because of what has happened. We also see anger exhibited in the story of Job, specifically Job chapter 7 verses 11 through 21. Here's what Job Job says to the Lord on this occasion. I cannot keep from speaking. I must express my anguish, and my bitter soul must complain. Am I a sea monster or a dragon that you must place me under guard? I think my bed will comfort me, and sleep will ease my misery. But then you shatter me with dreams and terrify me with visions. I would rather be strangled. I would rather die than suffer like this. I hate my life, and I don't want to go on living. Oh, leave me alone for my few remaining days. What are people that you should make so much of us, that you should think of us so often? For you examine us every morning and test us every moment. Why won't you leave me alone, at least long enough for me to swallow? If I have sinned, what have I done to you, O watcher of all humanity? Why make me your target? Am I a burden to you? Why not just forgive my sin and take away my guilt? For soon I will lie down in the dust and die, and when you look for me, I will be gone. Again, Job is angry about the things that have happened to him, and he's angry at God. The phrase in that passage that resonates most deeply with me is when he says, I think to myself, my bed will comfort me and sleep will ease my misery, but then you shatter me with dreams and terrify me with visions. How often in our grief journey have we gone to sleep at night thinking surely sleep will provide a respite, a relief to our pain, only to have a dream about our loved one and then to awake and realize, no, they're not alive, they're still dead, and there's nothing that we can do about it. Someone once said that anger as a part of the grief journey tends to surface when we recognize that we will probably survive what has happened to us. And I think that there's a lot of truth to that. Having lost a child, I'll tell you one of the things that really bothers me when people say it to me. Some well-meaning people will on occasion say something like, well, you know, God lost a son too, and he knows just how you feel. And my irrational, emotional, angry self wants to respond with, no, he doesn't. God let his son die on the cross knowing that he was going to raise him from the dead in 3 days. I have to find a way to muddle along for 50 more years before I get to see my son again. I can't just check out because I've got a wife and 3 little girls that are depending upon me. This is not the same thing. Now, yes, I know that God knows how I feel, but my anger in that moment is coming from a place that recognizes I'm going to survive this and I'm going to have to keep on living, and I don't want to do that. Anger tends to surface when you recognize you'll survive what has happened to you. We are more accustomed in church world to suppressing our anger than we are with dealing with it. But rather, I believe it is important that we be willing to feel our anger even if it seems endless. The more we feel our anger, the more it will start to diminish and we can begin to heal. Recognize that the Bible never condemns anger per se, but rather what we do when we are angry. For example, in Ephesians chapter 4. It's important that we never deny our feelings as long as we're willing to acknowledge that our feelings are a terrible barometer of just about everything. The stage of anger is most viciously manifested against God, as we saw with Job and with Martha. However, recognize that God is the only one who is entirely prepared or completely prepared to deal with your anger. God is the only one who is completely prepared to deal with your anger. Anger, in fact, is actually an indication of the intensity of our love. Anger will be irrational, but it is a way for us to heal as a part of our grief journey. The third stage of grief is that of bargaining, the stage of bargaining. And this manifests itself in a variety of different ways. For example, it can manifest itself in us pleading, hey, I'll do anything if you preserve the life of my loved one. Maybe this comes after the initial diagnosis that they're sick and we know that they're fighting for their life. David did this when his infant son was stricken with a disease and he knew that the child was dying. He was pleading with the Lord in 2 Samuel 12 to preserve this child's life. That prayer wasn't answered, but David was pleading, Lord, please, I'll do anything if you preserve this child's life. After the death has taken place, sometimes bargaining takes the form of, hey, let's just call a truce. Let's just agree to disagree. I don't want anything to do with you. You don't have to have anything to do with me. Sometimes it comes in the form of just praying, Lord, please preserve the lives of my remaining loved ones. I think about this often with my 3 girls. I'll say to the Lord in prayer, please don't let anything happen to my 3 little girls because I can't handle the death of another child. Or maybe pleading, Lord, just let me see heaven. I'll do anything just to be reunited with my loved ones again. Probably, though, the most destructive way that bargaining plays itself out as a part of the grief journey is in our playing the what-if game, the what-if game. I am not going to say that what if has no redemptive value whatsoever. I'm not going to say that. However, I believe that playing what if can be very, very destructive because it's actually our attempt to retain control over an uncontrollable situation. Playing the what if game is our attempt to regain control over an uncontrollable situation. We think to ourselves, if I can just figure out the one thing that I did or didn't do to cause or not prevent this death, then I will finally feel better. I'll feel like I've regained a measure of control in my life. What we don't recognize, however, is that if we can legitimately land on something that we could have done or should have done, waiting at the end of that road is a tremendous amount of guilt. And so we exchange the feeling of being out of control, we exchange that for a lot of guilt. And so again, playing what if can be very, very destructive. However, I believe that it's very natural and normal, it's human for us to do that. Recognize that our Lord bargained in the Garden of Gethsemane, Mark 14 and parallel passages, where he prayed to the Father, "Let this cup pass from me." And yet he also said, "Not my will, but yours be done." I believe that bargaining, including playing what if, I believe that bargaining brings temporary relief to our pain, and it helps us transition through our grief. It helps us with the ultimate acceptance of our loss. However, the brutal reality is that we eventually realize our loved one died, and there's nothing that we can do to bring them back. The fourth stage of grief is that of depression. And in the church, I believe that depression is often wildly misunderstood. A lot of people believe that depression is simply feeling sad all the time, and yet nothing could be further from the truth. Instead, depression is more like you feel like an immense fog or a cloud has settled upon you, and the energy to perform the most basic daily routines has suddenly left you. Several years ago, my family doctor was attempting to diagnose me with clinical depression, and he asked me a couple of questions, including, he said, "Do you sometimes find it difficult to get up the energy to maybe do everyday things such as going and checking the mail or doing chores around the house or buying groceries?" And I said, "Absolutely." And he said, "Well, I think you suffer from depression." But about a year ago, he and I went on a little Civil War battlefield tour up into Pennsylvania and Maryland and Virginia, and we were reminiscing about that time 12 years ago when he diagnosed me with depression. He told me that he had recently recalibrated his approach to diagnosing depression among his patients. He told me he would ask them this. He said, "Imagine that your best friend in the entire world, whom you haven't seen in a while, suddenly comes to town and calls you up, surprises you, and said, 'Hey, let's go get coffee this afternoon.' Now, in this scenario, you haven't seen your friend in a long time. You love them. You have nothing planned that afternoon. You love coffee, and yet you say to them, 'No, I don't feel like it.'" He said that's a classic symptom of depression. And that really hit home for me because I remember about 3 weeks after my son passed away, my favorite college football team, the Alabama Crimson Tide, they played in the college football playoffs in Arlington, Texas, there in AT&T Stadium. They played against Michigan State. And this was about 3 weeks after Daniel died, and the day of the game, someone offered me a free ticket to the game, and it was a great seat, and I only live 20 minutes from the stadium. So again, my favorite team is playing 20 minutes away. I've got a free ticket, great seat, and yet my response to the offer was, "No, I don't feel like it." Now, in my defense, we had a lot of people in our house over the previous couple of weeks with Daniel's death and the holidays and so on, and I was finally grateful to have my house back to myself, if you will. But looking back on that occasion, I recognize, yes, I was feeling depressed. And before we go any further, I want to make something very clear. Just because you feel depressed as a result of grief doesn't necessarily mean you suffer from clinical depression. The two are very different, and yet they manifest themselves in different way, or in the same way. So even though depression from grief and depression that's just a chemical imbalance, they manifest themselves the same way. Just because you feel depressed after a loss doesn't mean you have a mental illness. And I want you to make sure that's clearly understood. But certainly we see depression reflected in the Bible For example, in Psalm 69, notice how David describes what is going on around him and how he feels about it. He says in this particular passage, verses 1 through 3, "Save me, O God, for the waters have come up to my neck, and I sink in deep mire where there is no foothold. I have come into deep waters, and the flood sweeps over me. I am weary with my crying out. My throat is parched, and my eyes grow dim, waiting for my God." In this particular passage, David is likening the depression that he feels to this feeling of sinking down into the deep mire, almost like quicksand, or maybe being in a swimming pool or out in the ocean, and you're fighting, trying to tread water, you're kicking with all your might, and yet it seems as if the more you fight, the more you start to drown, the more pool water chlorine you're swallowing, the more the waves in the ocean are slapping you in the face. The key here, the idea that I want you to latch onto is this: the more you fight it, the more you succumb to it. The more you fight it, the more you succumb to it. And then picking up in Psalm 69, beginning in verse 13, notice what he says. "But as for me, my prayer is to you, O Lord, at an acceptable time, O God, in the abundance of your steadfast love. Answer me in your saving faithfulness. Deliver me from sinking in the mire. Let me be delivered from my enemies and from the deep waters. Let not the flood sweep over me, or the deep swallow me up, or the pit close its mouth over me. Answer me, O Lord, for your steadfast love is good. According to your abundant mercy, turn to me." We look at this passage, and I want you to notice what he says there in verse 13, "at an acceptable time." This is what I believe about depression. I do not believe that all depression is from the Lord, but I do believe that depression will lift according in God's good time when it has served its purpose. The most common response to depression is to deny it, but the most helpful way to deal with depression is actually maybe to show hospitality to it. And let me try and illustrate what I'm talking about. This was a tactic that was taught to me a couple of years ago by one of my counselors. She said, "When you feel depressed, I want you to sit in a room by yourself. I want you to imagine that depression is an embodied spirit or embodied person that is knocking on your door and wanting to come inside, and obviously it is a very unwelcome guest. But you invite depression in," she said, "and I want you to sit with it in the room and just feel it. And don't fight it, don't try to get rid of it, don't deny it, just learn to sit with it." And I thought, I can do that. What some people may not know about me is that I'm actually very introverted. I'm a very socially awkward person. I'm also highly competitive. And so when I feel depressed, I like to sit in a room, imagine the depression is sitting in the room with me. I've shown hospitality to it. Hey, come in, sit down, stay a while, even though it's an unwelcome guest. And I try to make depression feel so awkward in my presence, it eventually gets up and leaves because I can't stand to be around that weird guy anymore. Now, this may be a little bit humorous to think about, but I want you to again latch onto this idea that instead of fighting depression, instead of denying depression, learn to show hospitality to it. I do believe that if we will learn to sit with our depression, if we will learn to sit with it, we'll notice some things about depression. For example, if we don't look for a way to escape it, we learn instead to see depression as a way of cleansing us. We allow depression to teach us something about ourselves. If we do that, I believe that it will lift in God's good time. Again, notice what David says there, "at an acceptable time, O Lord." Specifically, there are three things that depression can do for us as a part of our grief. Number one, depression forces us to slow down and evaluate exactly what it is that we've lost. Number two, depression will rebuild us from the ground up. And then number three, depression will force us to deal with some things that for a long time we have foolishly tried to bury in the deep recesses of our soul. Depression can be very helpful when it comes to recovering from grief. With all that said, I want something else to be very, very clear. Depression is not a sign of a weak faith or that you don't have a good relationship with God. Depression and not having a good spiritual life, there is no necessary connection between the two. Now, obviously, if we are living a sinful life in rebellion against God, we may very well feel depressed as a result, especially if we were raised to love the Lord and we know better than to do the things that we're doing. But I want you to understand that just because you feel depressed does not mean that you have a weak faith or that you are rebelling against God. In fact, some of the people that I know with the strongest faith also suffer chronically from depression. But then we finally come to the last stage of grief, and that is the stage of acceptance. The stage of acceptance. This is not feeling okay with what has happened, but learning to live with this horrible new normal. It's not about liking a situation, but rather acknowledging all that we've lost and learning to live with that loss. One thing that I want you to recognize is that the more your identity was wrapped up in the person that you've lost, the more difficult it is going to be to move on to acceptance. For example, you have someone that for a long time has been caring for a loved one who is terminally ill, maybe a parent or a spouse, and then that person finally passes away. Your entire life had become wrapped up in caring for that individual, and now that they're no longer around, it might be very difficult to move to acceptance. I'm also thinking about parents who sadly bury a child. Both parents obviously are going to be very devastated, but perhaps if it's the mother who was the primary caregiver for that child, she was the one that stayed home and looked after that child, she might very well have a harder time moving to acceptance because all of her identity was wrapped up in caring for that child, and that child is no longer there to be cared for. But also recognize that acceptance can bring us closer to the person that we've lost. Moving to acceptance means that we love them more and not less. I remember a few months after our son passed away, my wife commented to me that she felt like she was having a hard time moving on to acceptance because she felt like if she moved to acceptance, then she was really exposing the fact that she had never really loved our son in the way that a mother should. And because I am such a loving and sensitive husband, I told her, that's the stupidest thing I've ever heard of in my entire life. I said, one has nothing to do with the other. This doesn't mean that you didn't love our son at all. In fact, it means that you love him more. Finding acceptance is going to look different for different people in different situations. For some, acceptance may only be experiencing more good days than bad. But for the Christian, I believe that we can see acceptance beautifully illustrated in the book of Habakkuk, chapter 3, in the final verses of the book. The story of Habakkuk is a prophet who initially cries out to God about the evil and the wickedness around him. Lord, do something about these evildoers, he says in the early part of the book. And God says, I'm going to do something about the evildoers. I'm going to bring the Babylonians in. They're going to sweep you up. They're going to haul all of you off to exile and destroy the city of Jerusalem. And Habakkuk is devastated. He's dumbfounded. Hey, Lord, I just want you to do something about the evildoers. I didn't want you to throw out the baby with the bathwater. And the rest of the book of Habakkuk is about the prophet trying to come to grips with what is about to happen to himself and his people, his nation. At the end of the book, Habakkuk has this to say, and as I read these words, remember something important. In Habakkuk's day, agriculture was not simply a part of the economy, agriculture was the economy. And in the final verses of Habakkuk 3, the prophet says, though the fig tree should not blossom, nor the fruit be on the vines, the produce of the olive fail, and the fields yield no food, the flock be cut off from the fold, and there be no herd in the stalls, yet I will rejoice in the Lord, I will take joy in the God of my salvation. God the Lord is my strength. He makes my feet like the deer's, and he makes me tread in my high places. For the Christian, acceptance, it can very well be coming to the place where we say, I still hurt, I still scream in pain, I still shake my fist at heaven at times, but always with the understanding, with the acknowledgement that I will rejoice in the Lord, I will take joy in the God of my salvation, because the Lord God is my strength. I hope that you have benefited from this session. I hope that you have come to understand that whatever you feel and whenever you feel it as a part of the grief journey is completely normal. I hope in our discussion of the 5 stages of grief, denial and anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance, as we looked at all of them and how they're reflected in the Bible, I hope that you gained an appreciation for the fact that God has created us to feel these things as a part of the grief recovery process, that there's nothing wrong with you for feeling these emotions, and that in all of them, God is remarkably faithful to us.